Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Today, I want to talk about some of the books I read for Shorty September, that time when BookTube focuses on short books and stories, however one defines short. The hosts for Shorty September are Bert of Storytime and Heather of Soggy Expat Book Nerd. I'll leave links to their channels down below in the description box. For Shorty September, I'm going to divide the books I've read into two separate videos. Actually, I'm not going to include everything I've read so far this month, only the books I found especially beautiful, or especially interesting, or perhaps especially infuriating. Today, I want to talk about a few 20th century classics. In my next Shorty September video, I'll talk about some of the contemporary or even brand new fiction and nonfiction I've read this month. So, let's get started. First, I finally read A Month in the Country by J.L. Carr. This book, set in England in the years immediately following World War I, was shortlisted for the Booker in 1980. Tom Birkin, the narrator, is trying to heal from his time on the battlefield. He's arrived in a village in North Yorkshire, a village that's new to him, where his job is to try to uncover a medieval mural in the village church, a mural that's been covered with layers and layers of whitewash. What he discovers is that the work of restoration he's doing each day turns out to be restorative itself. Like so many men returning from the front, Tom has come to town with shell shock, causing him to stammer, but also causing him to isolate himself. Another former soldier is also working and living around the church, and he too is trying to heal from a different kind of devastation during the war. As Birkin becomes friends with that young man and with the other people, young and old, in the village, he begins to recover a sense of meaning in his life, partly because of his commitment to art and to work, and partly because of his experiences of love in all its guises. The plot does not exactly move forward, and when the novel ends, Tom is exactly where he was at the beginning, traveling with his few possessions to wherever might be next. The characters, too, are drawn fairly lightly. While there are a few funny moments and occasionally some surprising insights, in general, this is a really quiet little book. And it's incredibly beautiful, elegant, sad, and restorative. I read another 20th century classic about a soldier with shell shock during World War I, but this one was written during the war rather than decades later. It was published in 1918, and that is Return of the Soldier by Rebecca West, her debut novel. Just as Carr's book is about life away from the battlefield, West is talking about what happens when a shell-shocked soldier comes back from the front as he recovers. But in this book, the storyline doesn't follow the soldier himself, but what happens to the women who are waiting for him to return. In this book, the shell shock is much more severe. The returning soldier has completely erased the past 15 years of his life and doesn't remember the woman who is his wife at all. Instead, he assumes he's still in love with the woman he was dating all those years ago. To be honest, amnesia seems like an awfully convenient plot device, probably to all readers today. But after reading just a bit about shell shock in World War I, it seems like serious memory loss was a much more common symptom then than it is now. And the symbolism of West's choice to have her character lose 15 years, as the introduction to this book points out, is intense. It's the difference between life in the simpler Victorian era and life in the much more turbulent and more modernist Edwardian period. I won't go into the details here for fear of stepping into topics others might see as spoilers, but the word return has several different meanings here. And one of my favorite parts of reading this book was tracing the instability of that term. Related to that particular issue of, quote, return is what the novel says about the complications of war and what the women of the book feel about war. Again, I won't talk about the details, but the answers are some of the most interesting elements in West's work. I was also really drawn in by West's commitment to truth, to her characters choosing to act in support of truth rather than in support of happiness, even when acknowledging what is real might have profound consequences. Although I didn't love this book in the way I did A Month in the Country, I did find it both really moving and quite fascinating. In many ways, Rebecca West's book reminds me of Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. And while I haven't seen the film versions of either Return of the Soldier or A Month in the Country, I've now put them both on my list, my TBW. Is that a thing? Another classic short novel is Elizabeth and Her German Garden by Elizabeth von Armin. I know I'm in the minority here, but I didn't love this book. Certainly, there are things that make it really interesting, including the fact that back in 1898, when it was written, von Armin was writing, to a degree at least, about what we might call feminist ideas, long before feminism made much of a dent in society. I also really love the pleasure of reading about what Elizabeth cultivates right outside her door. Still, I was put off by her sometimes aggressive tone and her sense of superiority. I'm sure my resistance is partially because I'm a Southerner, raised in a culture that has a long history of embracing the oppression of hierarchy, but basically doesn't embrace sarcasm. There are many times when Elizabeth might be trying to be funny, but to me she seems petty and mean to the people who live around her. Perhaps I was just a bit too sensitive during this reading, maybe just too taken aback that the book wasn't what I was expecting it to be. I promise to try to read it again in a year or two or three. Anyway, on to the next book. Because I'm thinking about writing a formal review of a forthcoming short biography of the American author Willa Cather, I've been poking about in several older biographies of the author. One short edition I looked at is called Willa Cather and the Politics of Criticism by Joan Acocella. I won't get into the weeds on this since I know most of you would probably pass right over a title like this, but actually it's one of the funniest books I've read in some time. Acocella goes through the ways literary critics have talked about Cather from the earliest days until the present day, or rather the present day when she published her book in the year 2000 or so. What she points out is that the particular politics of the moment have dramatically affected how scholars and critics understand the author. So much so that one generation might say exactly the opposite of what the previous generation said, only to be overturned again by the generation to come next. Was Cather a dull and conservative old schoolmarm? So said many early critics. Did she oppose, or did she embrace, the movement of industrial workers during her early writing career? And then later, was she a feminist? Or was she hurtful to the feminist cause? Maybe she was a lesbian, closeted, but whose sexuality structured every story she wrote. Or not. What the author of the book argues is that when scholars and critics pile on to particular ideological approaches, what suffers is literary discussion, which becomes, as she says, quote, less and less about literature, more and more about whose side are you on. Note that when she writes these specific words, she's not talking about now, she's talking about the criticism of the 1930s. Acocella's final argument is basically that critics really need to stick close to their subjects and actually pay attention to the kinds of questions Cather herself is asking or the kinds of themes that Cather herself is emphasizing. Yes, I do agree with that sentiment. But at the same time, who doesn't? Often when we think we're avoiding speaking from a place of obvious assumptions or biases, it's only because we're unaware of our assumptions and biases. So just saying to pay attention to the text rather than politics, we can easily wind up being just as affected by politics, even if we don't realize it. Still, this book is a really fascinating look at how the perception of literature changes over time. Okay, the final book I want to mention is Jamilia, first published in 1957 by Chingiz Aitmatov, one of Kyrgyzstan's most well-known writers, and translated into English in 2007 by James Reardon. Told from the perspective of a young man and narrated by him, this novella is, on the surface at least, a character study of his slightly older sister-in-law, Jamilia, and to a degree, a young soldier who has arrived in their village after being wounded while away at war. I first heard about it, or at least I put it on my get-to-eventually reading list, back maybe 6 months ago, when Roz at Scallydandling About the Books mentioned it on her channel. Thank you, Roz. On my copy of this novella, there is a blurb from Louis Aragon saying that it is, quote, the most beautiful love story in the world. A blurb which gives prospective readers the wrong impression, I think. The quote's not wrong, but it means something quite a bit larger than what it might sound like. In addition to an actual romance, there's also a personal recognition of love. But what is most striking is the narrator's discussion of love more broadly. Love of the land, of the cultures we're part of, love of beauty. That last one is really important, since the narrator not only watches the romance here, but it and the love of the world he sees completely transforms him into an artist. I'm not quite sure how much to talk about this, but I see tremendous links between this book and My Antonia by Willa Cather. As I said while I was talking about the previous book, I'm planning to write a review of a new biography. I'm also really looking forward to reading a few Cather novels with a few other booktubers later this year. And one of the books I'm most looking forward to is My Antonia, which I've read several times over the years and have always loved, even though I fight against it at points. The echoes of that book are tremendous in this one, so much so that I think it should be slightly retitled My Jamilia. In Cather's novel, just as in Aitmatov's, what you get is essentially a young man looking back on some time in his youth spent with a slightly older young woman with a strong personality and a sense of self. Antonia and Jamilia make different choices about their romantic lives. But what's striking is that fundamentally the books are more about the growth of the narrator because of his contact with the female main character as a young person. Hence the title, My Antonia, I think. That and this are books about how particular narrators see these women. I won't get too specific about the myriad parallel details here for fear of giving away spoilers, but I do want to say that both Cather and Aitmatov write in what is in some ways a plain, spare style, but at the same time is often quite evocative and even lush. Maybe that happens more frequently in very short novels. Or maybe it happens more when you're writing about the kinds of landscapes that both Cather and Aitmatov were writing about. Jamilia and My Antonia are both about wide open land, how the experience of that wildness and openness affects the people who live off that land. And both authors use language that sometimes almost sexualizes that land, or perhaps just turns it into a metaphor. I'll read out one little section from Jamilia. Just to set it up, the narrator is sleeping in a shed, essentially, on a pile of hay, as are a couple of other people. He's having a bit of a transformation. And here's what he says. The storm broke. The felt covering was wrenched off the tent and flapped about like a stricken bird. The rain, whipped up by the wind, lashed down in raging torrents as though it were kissing the earth in passion. Mighty peals of thunder rolled across the heavens, and bright flashes of summer lightning lit up the hills as brightly as a field of tulips, while the wind howled and raged in the ravine. The rain came down, and I lay there buried in the hay, feeling my heart thumping in my breast. I was happy. I felt I had emerged into the sunshine for the first time after a long illness. Even though the rain and the lightning flashes reached me beneath the hay, I was content and fell asleep with a smile on my face, uncertain whether the sound I heard was the other two people in the tent whispering or the subsiding rain pattering on the straw. The rains had come and summer had ended. You could sense the dank smell of wormwood and wet straw in the air. What would autumn bring? For some reason, I did not give it a thought. Well, that will do it for this 20th Century Classics Shorty listing. Thank you so much to Bert and Heather, the hosts of Shorty September. And thanks to all of you for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon.